Welcome to my series on learning about actual city planning knowledge from a university degree that you can apply to your City Skylines 2 build and improve your urban planning knowledge without paying thousands of dollars for the privilege. Understanding the different complexities of density, mixed zoning, and urban structure is so important, and that's what this video will talk about. But I fear that Cities Skylines 2's density simulation code isn't built upon real-life density frameworks, but rather some invented gameplay code. So in this video, we will deep dive into a very academic and rigorous understanding of urban structure and density and see if we can actually put it into Cities Skylines 2. And at the same time, I will build my case city, Thornton. Let's begin. What is urban structure and why is it so significant? Urban structure relates to the distribution of activities, movement networks like buildings, open spaces, natural areas, and their relationships over space, generating specific urban patterns for different urban areas. Transport and land uses are core determinants of an urban structure. Urban morphology is an important term to explain the urban structure. Urban morphology at a city scale has three theoretical models on urban structure: concentric zone model by Burgess, sector model by Hoyt, and multiple nuclei model by Harris and Ullman, from the basis of an urban system, as you can see in this picture. You will learn more about these models as we go through. The spatial patterns at a larger urban scale have implications for shaping and transforming local scale urban structures, including physical elements such as buildings, blocks, the hierarchy of streets, open spaces, and public spaces. So what are these three models, and can we put them into city skylines? The urban structure is the key because it eventually evolves through history and time and shapes how people experience the places, access facilities and jobs, and travel to various locations within cities and towns. The urban structure is highly significant as it provides the framework and the essential elements as a foundation for detailed design and planning for the cities and towns. These aerial photographs that you can see offer reliable image-based information to identify the variations of urban structures in different cities, including the specific built form characteristics, patterns of movements, layers of historical development, and green spaces. Some cities such as Paris, Barcelona, and Rome evolved through more extended time with multiple layers of historical periods that shaped their current urban structures, while other cities are comparatively new and are located on a greenfield site or a new site. Planning commenced with sketches and master plans on a drawing board, considering good planning factors and a central theme around which the great planners consciously designed the elements. So looking at the three models of urban structure, concentric, sector, and multiple nuclei, which one do you include in City Skylines 2? So let's look at Thornton now and see which model of urban structure that our city is currently following. Is it a concentric, sector, or multiple? It looks like it may be following multiple nuclei first. So how does urban structure vary in a city? It comes from a term called the transect. It provides a realistic basis of zoning for development patterns or urban forms with specific qualities of place along a rural to urban continuum, as you can see below. It starts with the rural zones of T1 of natural, moving into rural, suburban, general urban, and urban center, and then urban core. Now let's look at some different cities. How do urban structures or forms vary across a cross-section from suburban zones to urban core zones or along the transect within the different cities that you see in these pictures? We have the US cities of Miami, San Francisco, Washington DC, and New Orleans. For example, tree canopy cover is much higher in suburban zones T3 and T4 than in urban zones T5 and T6 for all four cities. So the urban structure in the urban core of Miami and San Francisco are denser and have taller buildings than Washington DC. So should I go through and add more trees to my T3 and T4 sections in Thornton? I think we should. So what are the design and planning principles of urban structure? Well, there's 5 main principles, and the first one is integration. And as you can see from this picture, there are strategic centers, local centers, urban neighborhoods and suburban neighborhoods. Integration includes connecting the elements of urban structure such as open spaces, road networks, and centers beyond the site. The interrelationships of urban forms transitioning or merging with the immediate environs to create smooth integration. For example, the location of an apartment development is determined by neighborhood characters. These characters include the hierarchy of access to jobs, services, and connections at all levels of planning. So let's actually have a look at Thornton and see if we can find their strategic centre here, a local centre here, and the suburban neighbourhoods and the urban neighbourhoods. Can you locate these 4 attributes on your City Skylines map? The next principle is functional efficacy. Individual elements that constitute an urban structure such as blocks, neighborhoods, streets, open spaces, and public spaces function together to create an efficient urban structure. Look at this figure here. This provides the examples of functional planning from Canberra in Australia, from conceptual plan on drawing boards to a much more developed ground and master plan. Have you ever considered doing this with your city? The next guiding principle is environmental harmony. Energy efficient and ecologically positive environments create coherent and resilient urban structures. Solar orientation is an important factor for energy efficiency of buildings, as seen in this picture here of the solar orientation in winter. The fourth principle is the sense of place, the architectural design and heritage characteristics of urban structure shaped by the culture and history that enhances local identity and belonging for individuals and communities living in those places. These aspects are important for placemaking, linked to people's perceptions of a place. Let's see if we can find a place in Thornton that feels like it is culturally rich. And the fifth and final principle, of course, is commercial viability. The design characteristics of urban structures such as active shop frontages in mixed-use developments and a diversity of housing choices create positive marketing opportunities. Have a look at these 2 pictures here and see how they invite customers. Which one do you feel does it better? So how can we take these 5 principles and actually put them into something tangible? We can do that by the 7 elements. These are the movement framework, which talks about how pedestrians, vehicles, and public transport move about your city. The mix of land uses, the density patterns, the energy and efficiency, the landscape blocks, and of course, landmarks as focal points. Now let's actually turn to one of the best neighborhoods that has actually won awards in Red Deer in Canada. So let's head over to the city of Red Deer in Canada, as they presented a conceptual model neighborhood structure plan that is just brilliant. The picture you now see on screen is their model neighborhood structure plan. As you can see with the black circle there, it is a defined neighborhood that has entrances marked with design features such as banner, public art, and signage. It creates a neighborhood node with an integrated and street-orientated mix of uses. There are smaller parks and gathering spaces in this area, as well as quality design that addresses the relationship of the buildings to the street. There is also a multi-nodal transportation options with mixed-use commercial nodes based on a 500-meter walk radius and transport supportive densities. There is an arterial between the 2 quarter sections, a mix of housing types which transition logically between building forms, and we'll talk about this transition later in the video. It incorporates mid-block pedestrian crossings, sensitive transition in land use and scale to existing development. It also has parks and trails that are connected to a regional trail system so that you can head out and keep cycling. So let's look at the first step that we can do to try and achieve this, and that is the movement framework. Getting the movement right affects uses and activities, density, security, and the impact of the development on neighbouring places. The movement framework concerns the structural aspects of movement, focusing on the street and footpath networks. They are vital. The individual activities and components a movement structure includes are walking, cycling, public transport, and roads. A successful movement framework provides the maximum choice for how people will make their journeys. takes full account of the kinds of movement a development will generate and makes clear connections to existing routes and facilities. So let's follow a sim around and see if they take our paths or how they choose to get to work or school. The movement framework should, wherever possible and practical, make it as easy and attractive to walk, cycle, or take the bus rather than drive. This means providing the right kinds of route to fit the journeys that people want to make. The reason why one route is better than another depends on countless factors, many of them quite intangible actually. Hence, route assessment can never be an exact science, but predicting vehicle movements is only one part of the exercise. How people experience their journey is just as important, especially on foot. And the main thing there is we need to do a movement assessment. At the number one thing on the movement assessment is safety. So let's head back into Thornton and see if we can identify some of these things on a movement assessment. So, if you want to make a walkable neighborhood within your city, you need to have a design that is ease for walking, that includes local facilities that bring residents together, reinforce community and discourage car use. So the first component of a movement framework should be the walking distances from facilities. The quality of the routes is important, especially where there are obstructions such as busy roads or railway lines. To give walking priority means putting the everyday experience of the street first on the agenda. People should be able to walk in 2 to 3 minutes to the post box, which is 250 meters. There should be a newsagent or a corner store, someplace they can pick up milk or something simple within 5 minutes, which is 400 meters. There should be local bigger shops, a bus stop, the healthcare centre, and perhaps a primary school within a walking distance of around 10 minutes, which is 800 meters. So let's have a look at this site here that's due for redevelopment amongst two roads. What is the best way to connect it? The typical cul-de-sac response, which is a lot of people may fall trap into with this sort of site size, creates an introverted layout which fails to integrate with the surroundings. How about a more pedestrian-friendly approach that integrates the surrounding community, links existing and proposed streets, and provides direct links to the bus stops? This is what it then should look like at the end. This street pattern then forms the basis for perimeter blocks, which ensure that buildings contribute positively to the public realm. Let's have a look at a city that has done this well. It's the Coles and Riverside Planning Framework in Leeds. The location is on the River Aire. The project was about the planning framework for the regeneration of an area of redundant Victorian warehousing adjacent to, but cut off from the Leeds city centre. So one of the main central aims of the planning framework for this was to break through the barrier imposed by the railway viaduct and station, which served to bisect the riverside to the south and the city centre to the north. A new physical link to the city centre is now open and well used. This connects the Corn Exchange building, as you can see, to the riverside via a route punched through a railway arc and a new pedestrian river crossing. A lively urban quarter has now been developed, including shops, a hotel, flats and offices. Part of the movement framework is the type of grids, and we all love making grids, whether it's in a European build, an Australian build, an Asian build, or obviously an American build. The type of grid provides choices. The time-honored way of achieving efficient connections is to create a grid, which provides a simple structure allowing access throughout the area. The form may be orthogonal or more regular, but its virtues are the same. The grid also offers opportunities for traffic management, allowing restriction of car access in some streets. Grid spacing of 80 to 100 meters provides an optimal network for pedestrian and vehicular needs in most circumstances. The size of resulting development blocks has to be checked against proposed uses and building types and adjusted to suit. In central areas with intensive pedestrian activity, grid spacing of 50 to 70 meters provides an optimal circulation network. However, the movement grid of this scale may not be appropriate for structuring the overall urban form. For example, major urban blocks may be over 200 meters or more in any dimension with minor cross streets and footpaths through the blocks. Similarly, parallel street forms may be appropriate with minor cross routes, but issues of topography, orientation, and neighbourhood uses must also be put into account. Now let's have a look at the Birmingham Inner Ring Road. So a bit of background context first. The Birmingham Inner Ring Road was completed in 1971 and was regarded at that time as a classic improvement of its kind. The aim was to remove trunk road traffic from the centre core by building a 3.5 mile road around the city centre, punctuated by roundabouts at 7 junctions. In traffic management terms, something of the original aim has been fulfilled, but at the expense of severing the urban fabric at its most vulnerable points. The concrete collar which it has created has broken the traditional links between the city centre and neighbouring areas. In particular, for people on foot, it presents a hostile or impenetrable barrier. The pedestrian subways at the roundabouts are intimidating and humiliating and have blighted life and activity in the area around the roads. So, what did they do about this? Since 1988, Birmingham City Council has adopted a policy of remodelling the ring road in order to link the city centre to neighbouring areas. They vastly improved pedestrian access across the whole city, including the Lower Paradise Circus, to create a new pedestrian link to Centenary Square and the International Convention Centre. They recreated the old square as a pedestrian space on the route from the city centre to the law courts, and the removal of the subways improved the pedestrian link to the Chinese Quarter vastly. In designing new places, what role is the city centre to have when all the potential mixed-use elements are sucked to the edge? Let's answer this by looking at mixing uses. Successful communities require a full range of local services and facilities, including commercial, educational, health, spiritual, and civic uses. These need to be conveniently sited and connected to residential areas by safe and comfortable routes. Traditionally, towns have developed around crossroads, centers of activity, or stopping places, with the incremental growth of housing, retail, community, and employment uses around the original core. Yet despite the virtues of mixed development, as you can see in this picture, in modern development it often remains the exception rather than the rule. Now let's have a look at this picture closely. The benefits of mixed development. These are diverse. A successful and sustainable local neighbourhood is a product of the distances people have to walk to access daily facilities. The presence of a sufficient range of such facilities to support their needs, and places and spaces where a variety of activities can take place. These are exemplified by the traditional Victorian and Edwardian suburbs, which were built on the assumption that most movement would be by pedestrian. Other travel needs were serviced by a suburban rail line, the station providing the focus of retail, commercial, and civic activity. Such spatial and use patterns are often difficult to replicate in modern development due to current transport planning regimes, the dispersal of movement patterns facilitated by the car, and the trend towards ever larger retail centres, education and healthcare buildings in order to achieve the efficiencies of scale. This diagram here highlights a different strategy to zoning that is focused on walking and cycling, with a ring road for all movement, with employees easily within walking distance of all facilities. Furthermore, a more vibrant and sustainable form results from blurring the distinction between uses and designing places that make walking to the local centre and bus stop or railway station as convenient and comfortable as possible, as shown in this picture here. Planning system does not help. To illustrate, if we take a typical large site, land uses may include housing, a primary school, shops, offices, and some industry. Planning generally zones these uses and gives them relatively fixed boundaries before any serious design work is undertaken. On occasion, sites are carved into development parcels around a rudimentary road system without a clear urban design structure in place. At this stage, it is still not unknown for densities to be decided upon, as well as other fixed requirements like open space or the upgrade of, say, our high schools in City Skylines too. This approach frequently involves routing the main road round the site rather than across it. Such attempts to create a sense of place around a focal point often fail because the very uses that generate activity are on the edge of the site or beyond, in a nearby business park or out of town centre, and tend to be internalized as big boxes. A widely used benchmark is for mixed development neighborhoods to cover a 400-meter radius, as you can see in these pictures, equating to about a 5-minute walk. This translates into 50 hectares. One such way to develop the 400-meter rule is character areas. In many towns and cities, there is scope for strengthening existing neighborhoods where identity is based on a particular activity or mix, say a marketplace or a college, or devising new areas of special character. Such character areas can reinforce local identity and serve as a marketing tool to raise the profile of a particular place. Combining the primary activities of living and working supports a greater variety of secondary facilities. Grouping the main elements of the palette of uses to be accommodated will help to make a place. Within core areas, lessons can be learnt from the design of shopping centres, where uses are positioned to concentrate pedestrian flows by spacing anchor stores such as Kmart and Best Buy at a maximum of about 250 metres apart from each other. Something that is done in City Skylines too? Have a 200-meter 50 gap between our large bulk shopping centres? Or how about the 400-meter rule that I've just spoken about? I'm not sure, because City Skylines 2 could have the AI that regardless that if you build the shops and the employment right next to their house, that they may still end up taking their car, and that means that there could be some unrealistic aspects to City Skylines 2 that we just can't do anything about. Let's look closely at centres and the focus on public transport nodes. The highest concentration of activity should emerge naturally along principal routes or points of convergence, along high streets, at crossroads, and so on. These centres vary in size depending on location, the nature of the street network, and the overall densities and the size of catchments. Mixed-use centres are best located at crossroads and along main movement routes within walking distances of homes. This strengthens their identity, provides passing trade, and enables bus stops and or railway stations to be fully integrated. You can also think about injecting housing into the mix. Centres that have been a victim of post-war zoning demonstrate how vitality and viability are lost where housing is not part of the mix. Injecting housing into the mix wherever possible enables activity to be stretched beyond daytime office and shopping hours. So how can we make better edges and mixing uses within our city? This can be done by absorbing the big box into the mix. Sustainable development requires that out-of-town development, often monofunctional in nature, such as industrial, office, and retail parks, are curtailed. Stop doing this in City Skylines too. These things are horrendous. These elements are then brought back into urban centres to become part of the urban mix. This has fundamental implications in terms of form, density, and parking, particularly how to accommodate big boxes, whether multiplex cinemas, superstores, or retail hardwares. Just think of the parking that goes into these places, as developers will often be reluctant to change their standard approaches. It is important to establish that the provision of these facilities must be appropriate to the needs of the community. A preferred approach is this one. Absorb the big boxes into a transition area on the edge of your retail core. The presence of larger development blocks in these locations can provide sufficient land to wrap the main perimeter of the box with a skin of smaller buildings, concealing its bulk and creating active frontage. See this picture here. Sitting within the walkable catchment form are transport nodes. This also encourages more sustainable customer transport patterns. Select these special cul-de-sac locations where at least one site edge requires no frontage at all, such as adjacent to a railway line. This lessens the amount of exposed blank walls and servicing. So let's wrap and cap up these big boxes, because large stores and other big box retailers, they often stand alone with exposed dead frontages. They create particular problems for active and attractive streets. However, such building types can be modified to become more compatible with fine-grained urban settings by mixing horizontally and/or vertically with other uses, which may involve these aspects, like wrapping the perimeter on the street fronts with smaller units, such as this Sainsbury's supermarket on Clapham High Street, or how about building other uses on the airspace above the blocks, like Tesco supermarkets at Sheffield or Earls Court, or you could incorporate a well-designed upper facade for rooftop parking, such as this Waitrose in Fulham. Or finally, you could externalize more active uses such as cafes, boutique, playgrounds, and increase their transparency back into the street vibe. Another great mixing use is transition zones. The transition zone between your center and the edge of your city is this fertile land, which can be used for enormous character. These are normally hodgepodge areas that bridge the commercial core and the residential hinterland with just a dead space. It is within these zones that the most dynamic mix should occur, with shops, workspaces, storage yards, and houses existing side by side. Land values enable some of these lower density uses to thrive and provide the most scope for encouraging a life-work balance. In large schemes, transition zones can be useful to buffer homes and other noise-sensitive issues from activity sources. However, nighttime uses such as pubs and clubs and restaurants can also work well here. If positioned away from predominantly residential areas, they can also feed off one another when they are clustered. One of the best things that you can actually include in a transition zone are schools. Schools are also often best located in these zones between the higher density residential areas and local centres, where they are as close as possible to the majority of children that live there, and where they can be introduced without cutting off pedestrian access to the centre. Recent moves towards the creation of more sustainable towns and cities that offer a high quality of life whilst minimizing resource consumption such as energy, water and land have reawakened interest in the concept of density. The starting low density that Cities Skylines 2 requires you, but what current setback and parking standards can give you is this: low density single family dwelling where the forecourt is dominated by parking. But some people continue to equate higher densities with poor urban quality, such as overcrowding and reduced space standards. This misses a fundamental point. Density is only a measure. It is a product of design, not a determinant of it. The aim should therefore be not to achieve a given residential density, but to generate a critical mass of people able to support urban services such as public transport, local shops, and schools. So the in-between, medium density, townhouses, we're applying standards with a little bit more flexibility, and parking on street or no parking at all increases the site's potential and creates a strong street frontage. What about some actual research? From the DERT, they have shown that there is no correlation between urban quality and density, that developments driven by average densities and shaped by blanket standards relating to privacy, open space, parking, and highway geometry, for example, stultify design and tend to produce the lowest common denominator blandness. The recommended approach is design-led, concentrating on sustainable urban quality. Market considerations influence many of the housing forms in our real cities, and this, together with the design-led approach, makes density a measure of the product, and remember, it's not the determinant of it. So what are the benefits of higher densities? Well, there's social, like social proximity encourages positive interaction and diversity, improves viability of and access to community services, enables more and better integrated social housing. There's economic values, like enhances economic viability of the development, provides economies of infrastructure, but it also is beneficial to transport, not just the fact that it supports it and reduces car travel, but it can also mean that there are undercrofts or basement that makes parking economically viable, either for the residents live there or for a commercial premises nearby. And finally, environmentally, it increases energy efficiency, decreases resource consumption, creates less pollution, preserves and helps maintain public spaces, and reduces overall demand for development land, thus avoiding sprawl. But suburbs themselves are not bad. It's all about varying the density profile. And urban density does not mean town cramming. Density is a measure. How comfortable a place feels is a matter of the design and its social characteristics. The average density of many well-loved Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian terraces exceed by considerable margins the density limits in many local plans and would generally not obtain planning permission today. High density is often equated with high-rise. However, the tower blocks of the 1960s were built to low densities in ill-defined and poorly used space. The challenge to the designer now is to ensure buildings, streets and places are of a human scale. Moderate the mass of a building or group of buildings so that it steps up or down to its neighbours, and uses high quality landscaping to soften perceptions of a place. This picture here provides a ready reckoner for different densities. Two key messages underpin this picture. One, the need to relate densities to context and the need to provide a mix of densities within large developments. Each reflects differences in lifestyle and the trade-offs that different social groups make. The amount of space we desire around our homes and proximity to central areas is, for example, balanced against property price and commuting time considerations. The creation of socially mixed communities with varied lifestyles requires a choice of building types and settings. In general, it is possible to achieve this by not grouping too many of the lower density units together and by creating a fine-grained pattern of development plots. One way to do this is the intensity pyramid as seen in this picture here. On large schemes, it often proves useful to articulate different housing forms, in particular around a density pyramid. This requires the positioning of lower density forms at the edges of the project and the higher density forms around and in the local centre, with a gradation of types and sizes in between. Within this general approach, smaller hotspots of intensity can be created, for example a higher apartment block on a corner or at a gateway. There's also a term called the missing middle, as you can see in this picture, where most cities have the single family dwellings and then move all the way up to residential or flat style buildings. But there's also two dwellings, townhouses, multi-dwelling terraces, dual occupancies and manor houses. Thank God that Cities Skylines 2 has given us townhouses. Between site, net and gross residential density, and can I explain it away without boring you? Well, site density is used at the individual lot level, either as a measure of a single housing type or as a purely statistical measure of residential yield. It has a close correlation with lot area for houses and height for apartments. However, it is less reliable than net residential density when comparing different building types because it excludes the area required for street access. This can be important when comparing, say, integrated developments against houses that are accessed from the street front or small lot housing that is accessed from rear lanes. Next is residential density. This is the most versatile measure of density to use in the design and development process. This is because it can be applied from the scale of the single lot up to the precinct or even a whole suburb level. Net residential density will provide a reasonable indication of the intensity of your built form, whereas gross residential density measures the overall net residential density combined with the impact of local land use at the neighbourhood scale. This measure better reflects the actual human experience of a place than net residential density and can be useful if your purpose is to understand broader issues such as walkability. Don't worry, we'll look at some pictures soon. Gross residential density is best calculated when the physical or psychological boundaries of the neighbourhood or suburb are clearly defined. These boundaries might include the edges created by arterial roads or conservation reserves. Regional uses themselves should not be included in the area being measured. While gross residential density can be a useful measure, it is important to remember that this measure of density will include the overall area of open space, but not its distribution. In the example as you can see here, two suburbs may yield the same gross residential density of say 15 dwellings per hectare. That means they will have the same overall quantity of local land uses. However, in Suburb A here, open space is distributed as several small parks, linear drainage reserves and landscape buffers, but whereas in Suburb B, the open space is distributed quite differently, as a large set of playing fields on the edge of the suburb and one town park. Suburb B would feel more urban and walkable compared to Suburb A, and Suburb A would feel more suburban. However, these qualities would be hidden in the gross residential density figures. So how to calculate net residential density, and we're going to use Cities Skylines units here of each one of these little grid blocks. You calculate the road frontages, 23 units, 21 units here, 6 units here, 15 units here, and these dwellings that back onto Briar Rose Lane, so another 15 units, for a road total density of 80 units. The dwellings include the whole green area. Allotment A here has 90 units, B allotment here has 66 units, and the bigger allotment has 72 and 90 units for a total dwelling size of 318 measurement units. And with the road surfaces added, that's 398 units. You can start to see already the impact this little development is having on poor density numbers. Next, the amount of individual dwellings is 19. The total area of 398 divided by the dwellings of 19 gives us 20.94 dwellings. According to sustainable density measures, you should be targeting for 25 to 30 dwellings, or 150 to 200 inhabitants at a standard for this exact same size. But what about gross? Gross includes the green space, this park or any facilities, and the tree coverings that are here. Will things look considerably better once I factor in the gross and the green space? The green space here has another approximately 150 units for a total site area of 548. Now the population in this area is a meager 30 people at the moment, with 6 dogs and no children, which is rather odd. Does 30 people for this much land in a developing town seem okay to you? So let's do the math. Divide total gross area with the population. So 548 divided by the 30 residents here gives us 18.26. This tells us that if we should have 150 inhabitants in 25 dwellings, this Cities Skylines area is grossly underpopulated and should have another 100 inhabitants for the amount of green and facilities that are provided. So what can we do? We can rezone the busy street side to a higher density to bring the score closer to the standard and maximize the facilities and green space that we have provided. This now gives Kingsfield a population of 148 inhabitants and a much better gross score of 27, which is within the target range. The final area of urban structure is energy and design, and we're going to look at 3 case places. The K2 apartments in Melbourne is a medium density public housing development that sets a new benchmark in minimal environmental footprint through a reduction in energy use and water consumption and the use of recycled and reused materials. It comprises of 96 apartments in 4 interconnected buildings with a 4,800 square metre site. It has passive solar design methods for adequate daylight access and seasonal summer and winter temperature regulation in the apartments. The next is the Jubilee Wharf in Cornwall, UK. It is a mixed-use development that provides community services and is located on the riverside. It has 6 masonettes or living facilities, 12 work units, a nursery, a multi-use hall, an organic cafe and a landscaped courtyard. The studios hold exhibitions for local artists and craftspeople. There's a nursery for childcare and a meeting place for the community. It features a 75 kilowatt wood pellet boiler, solar water heater and passive ventilation system and recycled materials for the buildings. And finally, our third example is the Earth Song Eco Neighbourhood in Auckland, New Zealand. It's a medium density development with 32 homes in Auckland, built on 1.62 acres with a density of 20 dwellings per hectare. This development showcases passive solar design of houses orientated towards the north and solar hot water on the roof of the houses for hot water supply, reducing household energy use by 58% as compared with a conventional house. And finally, as you build your city, think about the final thing of navigating the space of urban structure, landmarks. They are distinctive buildings that act as reference points so that people can navigate or move easily in an urban space. You have learned about Kevin Lynch's 5 elements in this video of mine: nodes, paths, districts, landmarks, and edges. And landmarks are one of these elements that are vital. But there is one area that you should consider, and that is views. Views offer experiences of wider view angles from which pleasing views of urban landscapes can be seen. Add vistas to your city for that extra hint of navigating the space. So as we wrap up module 2, and so there's no homework, let's look at why are densities central to designing cities. Firstly, our cities are becoming more compact whether we like it or not, and this real-world occurrence could have a place in our own city builds. And in doing so, here is David Sims' 9 criteria for a livable, dense city from his book Soft City. 1. Have a diversity of built form from living to learning to recreation. Diversify your outdoor spaces with spaces that are multi-purpose and have a hybrid inside-out approach with spaces that connect buildings seamlessly to the outdoors. Be flexible, arrange your city to a human scale and make as much of your city walkable as possible. Have a city that has a sense of identity, a pleasant microclimate if possible, a smaller carbon footprint, and bring nature to your city. Stay tuned for Module 3 on connected places, where we will look at an in-depth city planning knowledge on street hierarchy, parking, and designing great streets.